Saturn is more than the cold hand of time, or the devourer of generations. Beneath his grim exterior lies the alchemist's secret: lead that can be transmuted into gold, darkness that gives birth to light. Across alchemical, Kabbalistic, and occult traditions, Saturn emerges not just as a boundary, but as a catalyst for profound transformation. He governs the dissolution that precedes birth, the discipline that refines raw potential, and the shadow that, when embraced, reveals untapped power. If you haven't watched part 1, where we explored Saturn's mythological and astrological roots, be sure to check that out first. And if you're ready to journey deeper into the mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Let's begin. In the Hermetic science of alchemy, Saturn transcends mere mythological or astrological symbolism to become a central operative principle in the great work of transformation. Alchemical Saturn represents multiple interconnected concepts: the prima materia, the nigrido phase, the metal lead, and the process of putrefaction and dissolution necessary for regeneration. This multivalent symbolism makes Saturn arguably the most important planetary archetype in alchemical philosophy. Saturn's metal, lead, occupies the lowest position in the traditional hierarchy of metals, corresponding to its distance from the Sun in the geocentric model of the cosmos. Lead's physical properties, heaviness, density, malleability, and dullness, perfectly embody the spiritual qualities associated with Saturn: gravity, melancholy, inertia, and obscurity. As the heaviest of the common metals, lead represented the maximum point of material condensation, the furthest extension of spirit into matter. The famous alchemical maxim, "as above, so below," finds perfect expression in the Saturn-lead correspondence. Lead's physical capacity to absorb and contain other substances parallels Saturn's mythological role as the devourer of his children, its resistance to transmutation being one of the most difficult metals to work with alchemically, mirrors Saturn's stubborn resistance to change. Yet this very resistance made lead Saturn the essential starting point for the alchemical opus, embodying the principle that transformation must begin with the most dense and resistant aspects of being. The nigrido, or blackening phase, governed by Saturn, constitutes the first major stage of the alchemical work. Alchemical texts describe this as a period of putrefaction, dissolution, and mortification, processes that break down existing structures to prepare for new creation. The 16th century alchemist Gerhard Dorn describes this phase as the death of the compounds, where the original substance loses its form and identity. This dissolution was often depicted as a raven, Saturn's bird, a black sun, or a skeleton with a scythe, clear Saturnian imagery. Psychologically, the nigrido represents the confrontation with the shadow self, the repressed and rejected aspects of consciousness that must be acknowledged and integrated for wholeness to emerge. Carl Jung, who recognized alchemy as a symbolic system describing psychological transformation, identified the nigrido with depression, disillusionment, and the dark night of the soul that often precedes spiritual breakthrough. This interpretation reveals Saturn's role as the initiator of profound transformative experiences that, while painful, are necessary for authentic development. Alchemical iconography abounds with Saturnian imagery. The senex, or old man, often depicted with a crutch or scythe, personifies alchemical Saturn as the embodiment of primordial wisdom gained through suffering and time. The famous engraving, "The Melancholy of Saturn" by Albrecht Dürer, captures the contemplative, introspective quality of Saturnian consciousness. Surrounded by the tools of measurement and construction, the winged figure represents the creative potential that emerges from Saturnian limitation and focus. Beyond the nigrido, Saturn's influence permeates other phases of the great work. In the albedo, Saturn's leaden density gives way to lunar silver, representing the purification that follows dissolution. In the rubedo, Saturnian lead is transmuted into gold, embodying the alchemical triumph over time and decay. Even at these later stages, Saturn's disciplining presence remains essential, constraining volatile energies and preventing premature culmination of the work. Practical laboratory alchemy involved numerous operations involving lead and Saturnine substances. Lead acetate, Saturn sugar, and lead oxide, litharge, were common ingredients in alchemical preparations. The black dragon, or Saturn's dragon, referred to antimony, a metal often used to separate gold from silver and thus associated with Saturn's discriminating function. These material operations paralleled internal spiritual processes, embodying the alchemical principle that external and internal transformations proceed in tandem. The 17th century alchemical emblem book Atalanta Fugiens by Michael Meyer contains several images explicitly connecting Saturn to alchemical processes. Emblem 21 shows Saturn devouring a stone instead of his son, illustrating how the substitution of the alchemical stone for the divine child represents the transformation of destructive time into the timeless perfection of the philosopher's stone. This image beautifully captures how alchemy redeems Saturn's mythological limitations through spiritual transmutation.
Renaissance alchemist Basil Valentine's 12 Keys describe Saturn as the keeper of the gates, whose conquest is necessary for alchemical success.
Valentine writes, "The old father Saturn must putrefy and be cleansed of all his impurity, for no noble birth can take place without previous corruption." This statement encapsulates the paradoxical Saturnian wisdom that destruction is necessary for creation, that limitation enables transcendence, and that confrontation with darkness reveals the light. Within the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, Saturn finds its most profound and metaphysically complex correspondence in the Sephirah of Binah, the third emanation on the Tree of Life. This association reveals how Saturn's energy operates at the cosmic level of creation itself, establishing the fundamental structures and limitations that make manifestation possible. The Saturn-Binah connection opens a window into how divine limitation serves as the matrix for all subsequent creation.
Binah, whose Hebrew name translates as understanding, represents the primordial feminine principle that receives and gives form to the undifferentiated force of Chokmah, or wisdom.
In the dynamic of cosmic creation, Chokmah provides the vital energy while Binah gives it structure and definition. This perfectly mirrors Saturn's mythological role as the boundary setter and form giver. Just as Saturn's rings visibly encircle and contain the planet, though unknown to ancient astronomers, Binah's energy encompasses and delineates all that exists within created reality. The Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah, describes Binah as the palace of all worlds, the womb in which creation takes form. This maternal symbolism connects Binah to Saturn's mythological role as progenitor, albeit with a crucial difference. While mythological Saturn devoured his children, Kabbalistic Binah nurtures and sustains creation through the very act of limitation. This represents a profound transformation of Saturn's energy from destructive to constructive containment. Binah is traditionally associated with the color black, the direction north, and the element of water in its most formative aspect. These correspondences mirror Saturn's traditional associations with darkness, coldness, and the watery quality of dissolution. Yet in Kabbalah, these qualities are understood not as negative, but as necessary aspects of the divine creative process. Darkness as the womb of light, cold as the container of heat, water as the matrix of form. The Kabbalistic concept of din, judgment, or severity finds its highest expression in Binah. This quality of discernment and boundary setting establishes the cosmic order that allows individual beings to exist as separate entities. Without the Saturnian Binah function of limitation, all would remain in undifferentiated unity, a state of potential rather than actualization. Thus, paradoxically, separation from unity becomes the necessary condition for relationship with unity. Binah's position on the Tree of Life reveals much about Saturn's function in Kabbalistic cosmology. Situated at the top of the left pillar, the pillar of severity, Binah balances and complements Chokmah on the right pillar, the pillar of mercy. This polarity establishes the fundamental tension between expansion and contraction, mercy and judgment, that drives cosmic evolution. Saturn Binah represents the necessary restrictive force that balances unlimited expansion, preventing dissolution into chaos. The Kabbalistic concept of the abyss or death, separating the supernal triad, Kether, Chokmah, Binah, from the lower Sephiroth, further illuminates Saturn's boundary-keeping function. As the last Sephirah before the abyss, Binah represents the final stage of purely divine energy before its descent into more individuated forms. Saturn thus marks the threshold between the unified divine realm and the diversified manifest realm, the point where the infinite becomes finite. In practical Kabbalah, meditative techniques focusing on Binah aim to develop the capacity for deep understanding through contemplative limitation and concentration. These practices often involve visualizing the color black, contemplating the Hebrew letter He, and intoning the divine name Elohim, all correspondences of Binah. These techniques harness Saturn's energy of contraction and focus to penetrate beyond surface appearances to essential structures. The association of Binah with the divine name Elohim is particularly significant. Unlike the Tetragrammaton, which represents God's essence beyond form, Elohim is the name used in Genesis for God as creator, establishing boundaries, separating elements, and imposing order on chaos. This creative restrictive function perfectly embodies Saturn's energy as the architect of cosmic structure. Isaac Luria, the 16th century Kabbalist who revolutionized Jewish mysticism, introduced the concept of Tzimtzum, or contraction, the idea that God's first creative act was self-limitation, withdrawing to create space for the world to exist.
The Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum, or contraction, the idea that God's first creative act was self-limitation, withdrawing to create space for the world to exist, represents the ultimate Saturnian principle.
Through Tzimtzum, Saturn's restrictive energy is reframed as the primary divine gift, the necessary self-contraction that makes relationship and diversity possible. Medieval Kabbalist Rabbi Moses Cordovero wrote in Pardes Rimonim, the pomegranate orchard, that Binah gathers, holds, and forms everything that comes from the right side, describing how Saturn Binah receives and structures the vital force of Chakma. This description reveals Binah not as opposing creation, but as completing it, providing the vessel without which energy would dissipate uselessly. The Kabbalistic pattern of Sabbath observance also reflects Saturn's influence. The seventh day, Saturn's day, Saturday, becomes a day of rest and contemplation, a time boundary that creates space for communion with the divine.
The Sabbath represents time made sacred through limitation, embodying the paradoxical wisdom that restriction can lead to the greatest freedom.
This transmutation of Saturn's restrictive energy into spiritual opportunity lies at the heart of Kabbalistic understanding. As Western esoteric traditions evolved through the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and modern era, Saturn's symbolism acquired increasingly complex and sometimes ominous dimensions. Far from the agricultural deity of ancient Rome or the philosophical principle of Neoplatonism, occult Saturn came to represent the shadow aspects of existence, those elements of reality that consciousness typically represses or rejects. This transformation reveals much about how ancient deities evolved to embody cultural and psychological preoccupations across historical periods.
The Gnostic reinterpretation of Saturn as Yaldabaoth, or the Demiurge, significantly influenced later occult conceptions.
In Gnostic cosmology, the material world was not created by the true, transcendent God, but by a lower, ignorant deity who imprisoned divine sparks within physical bodies. This demiurge, often associated with Saturn Kronos, represented the limiting principle gone awry: constraint become imprisonment, boundary become barrier. This negative interpretation of Saturn's function emerged from the Gnostic rejection of material existence as fundamentally flawed.
Medieval grimoires and magical texts presented Saturn as both perilous and powerful.
The Pecatrix, an influential 11th century magical handbook, describes Saturn as governing hindrance, denial, delay, old age, death, fathers, grandfathers, distress, corpses, graves. Yet it also acknowledges Saturn's dominion over profound sciences, true revelations, dream interpretation, and all subtle and mysterious things. This ambivalence reflects the understanding that Saturn's energy, while challenging, grants access to hidden wisdom unavailable through more benevolent channels. Renaissance magician Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, in his 3 books of occult philosophy, provides detailed instructions for constructing Saturnian talismans and invoking Saturnian intelligences. These operations required careful timing, specific materials, lead, black stones, cypress, and protective measures due to Saturn's potentially dangerous influence. Agrippa warns that unprepared practitioners might experience melancholy, illness, or misfortune from improper Saturnian workings. Yet he also promises profound wisdom, hidden treasure and communication with spirits to those who master these forces. The association between Saturn and the devil in Christian demonology further darkened Saturn's reputation. The medieval mind, observing Saturn's associations with limitation, death, and materiality, found parallels with theological conceptions of Satan as the restrictor of spiritual freedom. This connection was reinforced by iconographic similarities. Both Saturn and the devil were often depicted as elderly, bearded figures wielding instruments of harvest or punishment. Yet careful esotericists maintained the distinction between Saturn as a necessary cosmic principle and the devil as a moral adversary. Early modern astrologer and physician Nicholas Culpeper describes Saturn's influence on human health in Culpeper's Complete Herbal. Published 1653, Saturn causes long sicknesses, quartan agues, falling sickness, black jaundice, leprosy, flux of humor, apoplexies, palsies, and disorders that proceed from cold dryness and melancholy. This medical perspective on Saturn demonstrates how Saturnian symbolism permeated practical aspects of life beyond religion and philosophy. The 19th century Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn integrated Saturn into its system of ceremonial magic as one of the 7 planetary forces to be invoked, controlled, and balanced. In Golden Dawn symbolism, Saturn corresponded to the Hebrew letter Tau, the final letter of the alphabet, reinforcing Saturn's association with endings and completion. Golden Dawn rituals involving Saturn aim to transform its restrictive energy into the wisdom that comes from accepted limitation and conscious encounter with mortality. Aleister Crowley, emerging from the Golden Dawn tradition, offered a particularly nuanced interpretation of Saturn in his magical system of Thelema.
Aleister Crowley associates Saturn with the great work accomplished, suggesting that Saturn's energy, when properly transformed, represents the culmination of spiritual development rather than its obstruction.
Crowley's approach exemplifies the mature occult understanding that Saturn's challenges are necessary initiatory experiences rather than obstacles to be avoided. The concept of the dweller on the threshold, introduced by Bulwer Lytton in his occult novel Zanoni, and developed by theosophical writers like Helena Blavatsky, represents a Saturnian archetype in modern occultism. This entity, encountered by the initiate at the boundary between ordinary and higher consciousness, embodies all the unresolved psychological material that must be confronted before spiritual advancement is possible. Like Saturn, the dweller serves as both guardian and challenger, testing the initiate's readiness to transcend limitations. Carl Jung's psychological interpretation of alchemy provided a framework for understanding Saturn's occult significance in depth psychological terms. Jung identified Saturn with the archetype of the wise old man, or senex, the figure representing both constriction and wisdom, limitation and mastery. In Jungian psychology, conscious engagement with Saturnian energy enables integration of the shadow self, leading to the emergence of the self-archetype and psychological wholeness. This approach transforms Saturn from an external deity or force into an internal psychological principle. Modern planetary magic and astrological practice continue to work with Saturn's energy in various ways. Magical operations involving Saturn often focus on establishing boundaries, ending unwanted situations, binding negative influences, or gaining wisdom through contemplation of mortality. These practices typically employ traditional Saturnian correspondences, the color black, the number 3, the metal lead, the jewel onyx, while incorporating psychological understanding absent from earlier traditions. The concept of shadow work in contemporary occultism represents a direct engagement with Saturnian energy as manifested in the repressed aspects of consciousness. This practice involves deliberately confronting and integrating disowned parts of the self, limitations, fears, destructive tendencies, and painful memories. Like Saturn's mythological role as the revealer of hidden truths through limitation, shadow work reveals that our greatest spiritual resources often lie buried within our most difficult experiences.
Saturn is not a villain, but a cosmic necessity, a force that reveals how limitation births form, how darkness yields wisdom, and how time, while devouring, also deepens. We demonize Saturn because we resist boundaries. Yet within those very constraints lie the tools of mastery: discipline, structure, and focus. In alchemy, Saturn's lead becomes gold not by escape, but through conscious transformation. Kabbalistic Binah shows how form contains potential. Without boundaries, creativity dissipates. Psychologically, Saturn's shadow invites us to grow. through failure, loss, aging. The Saturn return strips illusions, revealing authentic paths. True freedom isn't in breaking limits, but in working with them. Within rhythm lies music. Within time, the eternal. In a world of instant gratification, Saturn reminds us that depth requires patience, wisdom, and reflection. His paradox is profound. The god who ends things, but also prepares the ground for new beginnings. To embrace Saturn is to enter the alchemical process, to turn resistance into foundation, and time into timeless insight.